Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to this Institute lecture. Today our speaker is Eric Maskin. Eric is one of the world's leading economists, and his research on economic theory has had a profound influence on many areas of political science and law, as well as economics. Eric obtained his bachelor's degree and his PhD from Harvard University. He was Research Fellow from 1976 to 77 in Cambridge before joining the faculty of MIT. In 1985, he moved to Harvard, where he became Louis Berkman Professor of Economics in 1997. Since 2000, he has been the first Albert O. Hirschman Professor of Social Science here at the Institute. Eric's work has been recognized by many honors. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and, as of this week, the National Academy of Sciences. He's a corresponding Fellow of the British Academy and an Honorary Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. For his fundamental work on mechanism design theory, he was awarded the 2000 Nobel Prize in Economics, jointly with Leonid Hurwitz and Roger Myerson. This afternoon, Eric's title is Mechanism Design: How to Implement Social Goals.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. One of the more entertaining experiences I had last fall was seeing how the news media reported mechanism design to the general public. Here is a direct quote from Fox News. Mechanism design has something to do with achieving the greatest amount of economic impact for the seller based on that seller's individual criteria. I'd explain more of it, but I don't understand it, so I can't. Here's another quote, this time from an AP correspondent. Mechanism design is the sort of complex, highly technical, theoretical work that gives us business journalists the heebie-jeebies. But my favorite story comes from Car Talk, the public radio show where callers can phone in their questions to Tom and Ray about car repair. So on this occasion, Tom said to Ray, I think we should win the Nobel Prize. And Ray said, why is that? And Tom said, because we do something much easier to understand than designing mechanisms. We actually fix them. Well, actually, it turns out that mechanism design is not so hard to explain. And I hope to persuade you of that tonight, mainly by going through a few simple examples. But before I do that, let me at least have a crack at a one-sentence or two-sentence definition. I like to think of mechanism design as the engineering part of economic theory. So a lot of economics consists of trying to take existing economic institutions and figuring out what outcomes they're going to give rise to, or looking back what outcomes they did give rise to and why. And that's the positive or predictive part of economic theory. In mechanism design, we do exactly the opposite. That is, we start with the outcomes we want, the goals that we want to achieve, and we ask what kinds of institutions or procedures, more generally, what kinds of mechanisms could we design to achieve those goals. So this is the normative or prescriptive part of economic theory. So let's take an example. This is an example which probably is familiar to most of you from some birthday or other. So let's imagine that there's a parent, a mother, who wants to divide a cake between her two kids, Alice and Bob. And her goal is to make sure that each child is happy with his or her portion. So that means that Bob thinks that he's got at least half, and Alice thinks that she's got at least half. So if this is achieved, we'll call it a fair division. So that's the mother's goal, to achieve a fair division. Now, if she knows that she sees the cake exactly the way the kids do, then there's a simple solution for how to achieve a fair division. Namely, she'll just divide it equally, according to her view. And because the two kids, by assumption, see it the same way she does, they'll be happy. The problem is, what if they don't see it the same way? And this is probably the usual case. So what if Bob sees the cake differently from his mother? She thinks she's divided it equally, but he thinks that Alice's piece is bigger. Well, so here's the difficulty. The mother wants to achieve a fair division, but she doesn't have enough information to do this by herself because she doesn't know exactly how Bob sees the cake, how Alice sees the cake. So she doesn't actually know what a fair division is. Well, is there some way that nevertheless she can achieve a fair division? This actually is a very old problem. In fact, exactly this problem occurs in the Old Testament. Lot and Abraham are trying to decide how to divide up grazing land, and they want to make sure that each is happy with his own portion. And so not surprisingly, there's a very old solution to this problem, and probably many of you are familiar with it. If we're dividing a cake, we should have Bob do the actual division. So Bob cuts the cake in two, and then Alice chooses which piece she wants. So why does this work? It works because when Bob is dividing the cake, he's going to have a strong incentive to make sure that the two pieces are equal in his eyes, because if one of the pieces turns out to be bigger than the other, then Alice is going to take that one, since she gets to choose. So he'll make sure that whichever piece Alice takes, he's happy with the other one. And Alice is going to be happy with this procedure because she gets to choose. She can ensure that if the pieces do turn out to be unequal, she gets the bigger one. So this is an example of how we can achieve a goal when the mechanism designer, in this case the mother, doesn't even know, or doesn't even have enough information to achieve that goal on her own. And this is the essence of mechanism design. Let's look at a second example, a somewhat more complicated example. Suppose that the government wants to sell off the right to some telecommunications company to transmit on some band of radio frequencies. This is a real problem. It's not a made-up problem. In fact, in many countries throughout the world, including the United States, radio spectrum has been auctioned off to telecommunications companies, and in this country, the FCC has been holding sales now for over 12 years. So let's imagine that there are a number of telecommunications companies that want this license. What the government would like to do is to make sure that the company that gets the license, is the one that values it the most, because this company is likely to make the most efficient use or the best use of the license. This is what economists call an efficient allocation. The problem is that the government, or the FCC, doesn't know how much each telecom company values the license. So in other words, the government doesn't know what the best outcome is. Well, it could simply ask each company, how much do you value the license? But that's not likely to work very well, because if a company thinks that its chances of getting the license are going to go up if it quotes a higher number, it has an obvious incentive to exaggerate. And so probably what would happen if the government did this is that all of the companies would exaggerate, and then there'd be no guarantee that the one that actually got the license was the one with the highest value. So we could try something a little bit more sophisticated. We could have each company make a bid for a license and assign the license to the high bidder, and then have the winner pay the bid that it made. This sounds plausible, but it's not going to work either, and let me explain why. The problem now is that companies have an incentive to understate their values. So let's imagine that there's a company, Telemax, and it values this license at $10 million. Well, if it actually bid $10 million and won, it would be getting something that's worth $10 million, but it would be paying $10 million, so on net it would have zero. It might as well have not won at all, because it has a net payoff of zero, suggesting that an optimal strategy is to understate, is to bid less than 10 million, because although that might reduce your chance of winning, at least if you do win, you're going to get something positive. But if all the companies are underbidding, as they will, once again, there's no guarantee that the winner will be the one with the highest value. So, what do we do about that? Well, there's a very nice and easy solution to this problem. It's a slight twist on the mechanism that I just showed you. Let's have every company make a bid for the license, and once again award the license to the high bidder. But now, instead of having the bidder pay its own bid, it pays the second highest bid. This is what's called a second price auction. Some of you may be familiar with it from online auctions. Some online auctions are second price auctions. But let me explain how this works in an example. Let's imagine that if there are three bidders and one of them bids 10 million, one bids 8 million, a third bids 5 million. Well, then the winner will be the high bidder. the one that bid 10 million, but it will only pay 8 million because that's the second highest bid. Now, I claim that in a second price auction, companies no longer have an incentive to understate. And the reason for that is, if I'm a $10 million company and I bid 9 million, that's not going to change how much I pay if I win because I don't pay my bid anyway. I'll pay 8 million if that's the second highest bid. So understating is never going to reduce how much I pay. Furthermore, there's a risk if I do understate that I'll lose the auction altogether. If it's worth 10 million to me and I say bid 7 million, and the second highest bid is 8 million, I'll lose. And so I'll end up with nothing. So I'm better off not understating because there's nothing to be gained and there's something to be lost. Furthermore, I have no incentive to overstate either because say I bid $12 million. It's worth 10 million, but I bid 12. Well, if the other bidders all bid under 10 million, the fact that I'm bidding 12 million doesn't change things. I would have won with 10 million. I still win with 12 million. The only time overbidding makes a difference is if some other company has bid more than 10 million. Say some company bid 11 million and I bid 12 million. Well, then I will win, and I wouldn't have won had I bid 10 million, but I'll be overpaying because I'll be paying 11 million, and it's only worth 10 million to me. So that means that I don't want to overstate either. The only remaining possibility is that I should bid exactly what it's worth to me. That's the beauty of the second price auction. You have an incentive to bid exactly what it's worth to you, but if all bidders are bidding exactly what it's worth to them, then the winner will indeed be the winner with the highest value, which is what the government wanted in the first place. So once again, we have a mechanism which achieves the government's goal, the mechanism designer's goal, even though the mechanism designer itself doesn't have enough information to achieve that goal on its own. Let me give you one last example, and it's the most complicated example, but perhaps it will bring you closer to the essence of the theory. Let's consider a society. It's a small society. It just has 2 consumers, and they just happen to be Alice and Bob again. So these 2 people, Alice and Bob, consume energy. And there's an energy authority, and its job is to choose a public energy source for Alice and Bob. There are 4 possibilities. There's gas, oil, nuclear power, and coal. And the energy authority has to choose one of these. It can't choose multiple sources. So there's going to be one and only one energy source for Alice and Bob. Let's imagine that there are 2 possible states of the world. In one state, state 1 we'll call it, Alice and Bob do not put very much emphasis on the future. So they're much more concerned with their current consumption than future consumption. In state 2, just the opposite is true. They weight the future very heavily. And what implications do these two possible states have for the way Alice and Bob view these different energy sources? Well, let's start with Alice. Let's imagine that Alice cares mostly about convenience when it comes to an energy source. So that this means that in state one, where it's mainly current consumption that matters, she likes gas the most because that's the easiest to use, then oil, then coal, and then nuclear power. In state two, her preferences change, or they're different. Nuclear power becomes the best choice for her because she anticipates that technological improvements will make nuclear power much easier to use in the future. And the same is true, let's suppose, for gas and coal to a more limited extent. Well, let's look at Bob. Let's imagine that Bob cares mainly about safety. So in state one, where we're looking at, once again, at mainly current consumption, he likes nuclear power the most, then oil, then coal, and then gas. He's afraid of gas because of gas explosions. But in state two, where he's looking to the future, he puts oil first, then gas, then coal, and nuclear power goes to the bottom because he's worried that in the long run, nuclear power poses a risk because of the problem of getting rid of nuclear waste. So, to summarize, I've shown you Alice and Bob's preferences in these two states. So in state one, Alice puts gas up at the top, then oil, coal, nuclear. Bob puts nuclear at the top, then oil, coal, and gas, and similarly in state two. Now, the Energy Authority, let's imagine, is interested in choosing an energy source that makes a good compromise between Alice and Bob's views. So from that point of view, oil is a good choice in state one. Gas is not a good choice because although Alice likes gas a lot, Bob doesn't like gas at all. And nuclear is not a good choice because Alice puts that down at the bottom. And coal isn't a good choice because both consumers like oil more than coal. So oil is the natural choice in state one. And for exactly symmetric reasons, gas is the best choice in state two. Nuclear is no good, Bob doesn't like that. Oil's no good, Alice doesn't like that. And both consumers prefer gas to coal. So that means that what the authority would like to do is to choose oil if state one prevails, and gas if state two prevails. That's the authority's goal. The problem is that the authority may not know what the state is. So how could it proceed? Well, once again, the simplest procedure would be simply to ask Alice and Bob, what are your preferences, or which state it actually prevails? Do you put a lot of weight on the future or just a little weight on the future? And what the authority could do then is if both Alice and Bob said it's state one, then the authority could choose oil. And if they both said state two, the authority would choose gas. And if one said one and the other said the other, the authority could flip a coin. Well, this isn't going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is that Alice is going to say state two regardless of the truth. or at least she has a strong incentive to do that, because notice that in state 2, gas is optimal, but Alice always prefers gas to oil. In state 1, gas is above oil, and in state 2, gas is above oil. And so by saying that state 2 is the state, Alice is going to raise the probability that gas is chosen, regardless of what Bob says. It's more likely to be gas that's chosen if Alice says state 2. And for, again, exactly symmetric reasons, Bob always has the incentive to say state 1, because Bob always prefers oil to gas. So oil is above gas in state 1, oil is above gas in state 2. So what's going to happen if the government simply says what's the state is that Alice will say state 2, Bob will say state 1, regardless of what the actual state is, and so the authority is going to end up flipping a coin with 50% probability the authority is going to get it wrong. So this mechanism won't work. It's just a little bit too naive. So what can it do? Well, what it can do is to have the consumers participate in the following mechanism, given by this little table. So to understand this, think of Alice now as choosing either the top row or the bottom row. And Bob chooses the left column or the right column. And the outcome is just given by the energy source in the intersection of their choices. So if Alice chooses the bottom row and Bob chooses the right column, the outcome is going to be gas. And similarly for the other 3 entries. So this is what's called a game matrix or a game table. Well, what's going to happen if this game or this mechanism is actually played? Well, it depends on the state. Let's imagine first that state 1 is the actual state. The consumers themselves know which state prevails because they know their own preferences. So they know whether they put weight on the future or weight on the present. Now, if state 1 holds, notice that Alice is always going to want to play the top row. Because Alice, regardless of what Bob does, Alice prefers oil to coal in state 1. Whoops, I've got this wrong. Bob, let's see, Bob is always going to want to play Bob is always going to want to play the left column. that's what I was going for. Bob is going to always want to play the left column because Bob prefers oil to coal and also prefers nuclear to gas. So regardless of what Alice does, top row or bottom row, Bob is better off choosing the left column. But given that Bob is playing the left column, Alice is certainly going to play the top row because Alice prefers oil to nuclear power in state 1. And if she chooses the top row, she'll get oil. If she chooses the bottom row, she'll get nuclear power. So what will we expect will happen? Alice will play the top row. Bob will play the left column. This is what's called a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is just a configuration of choices by the two participants so that neither one has the incentive to do something else. So top row for Alice, left column for Bob is a Nash equilibrium. In fact, it's the only Nash equilibrium of this mechanism in state 1. And so oil is a pretty good prediction about what's likely to happen if this mechanism is played, assuming that Alice and Bob can think it through. And notice that oil is exactly the outcome that we want to have in state 1. So that leaves us with state 2. Well, in state 2, notice that Alice is always going to want to play the bottom strategy. Because in state 2, regardless of what Bob does, the bottom is better. Nuclear is better than oil. Notice that. And gas is better than coal. Alice ranks gas above coal. So Alice is always going to play the bottom strategy. And given that Alice is playing the bottom strategy, Bob will always want to go right because gas is better than nuclear for Bob. So in state 2, we expect that the outcome will be gas. And that's exactly what we want. It's the optimum outcome. So notice that this little mechanism gives us the right answer, even though the mechanism designer itself had no idea what the right choice was. And also, Alice and Bob don't care about the social optimum per se. They're just interested in their own objectives. We say that this mechanism implements the designer's goals because no matter what the state turns out to be, we get the right outcome. Now, I've shown you an example where there are just two possible states. The future is weighted heavily, the future is not weighted heavily, but the same principle applies no matter how many states there are. Well, the examples that I've been showing you, the cake example, the telecom example, the energy example, show you that there are cases where we can actually implement our social goals. There's a sense in which I've been pulling rabbits out of a hat. That is, I've shown you mechanisms that work, but I haven't shown you how we might discover that which mechanism works, or whether there's any mechanism at all that works. In other words, we're going to be interested in the more general questions. Can we tell, given social goals, given our social goals, whether or not they are implementable? That is, whether or not there actually exists a mechanism that implements them. And if the answer is yes, can we find such a mechanism? So those are two general questions. Don't worry, I'm not going to attempt to answer them tonight, but let me extend an invitation to you. A week from Monday, I'm going to give a follow-up talk for those of you who are interested. And at that talk, I will show you that the answer to both questions is yes, and I'll actually show you how to answer those two questions. The talk will be a little bit more technical than today. That is, I'll use some mathematical notation, but nothing that you should be scared of. If you know what a function is, you'll be fine. For tonight, let me just mention that there's a potentially huge range of possible applications of mechanism design. And let me just mention three that I hope will be considered in the future. One is to the problem of climate change. We now know from a great deal of science that not only is the Earth heating up, but that we're responsible for it. I should say that there remains some controversy about this, but for the purpose of argument tonight, let me take this as given. If we take this as given, then the remaining question is what to do about it. So let's imagine that the countries of the world agree that what they should do is to somehow limit greenhouse gas emissions, in particular carbon dioxide emissions. That's the social goal, but that social goal may be at odds with the country-specific goals of keeping their economy going or maintaining their standard of living. An international treaty on greenhouse gas emissions can be thought of as a mechanism which reconciles the social goal of carbon emission reduction with the individual goals of the participants. So the same principles of mechanism design that I've been talking about tonight are potentially applicable to the design of an international treaty or a series of treaties on carbon emissions. And I'm hoping that this will be a priority in the immediate future. Another timely application is to the problem of credit crises. We're in the midst of one now. And given that it's already started, there's lots of controversy about how to get ourselves out of it. But what I'm interested in from the point of view of mechanism design is how do we design a system that perhaps avoids credit crises altogether, or at least minimizes the risk. Once again, we have the social goal of banks continuing to lend, credit continuing to be available, with the possibly conflicting goal of the individual banks, how do they stay in business? So the problem from a mechanism design point of view is to, once again, try to reconcile those conflicting goals. The final mechanism is one that, again, I think is timely. Every 4 years we complain about the way we elect presidents, and this year is no exception. My own view is that we can do a lot better than the current system. I'm not just talking about the primaries. I think we can also do better as far as general elections go. But all three of these topics are subjects for other occasions. At the moment, I'd just like to thank you for your attention. And I believe we have time for some questions. Peter tells me we have until 7 o'clock, so Freeman.
Well, how do you propose to fix the climate?
I said this was a problem for the future. I have not. I've been interested in designing auctions for reducing carbon emissions. That's solving the problem on a national level. It's a more difficult problem. How do you get the countries of the world to agree? I don't have an immediate answer other than to say that I think one key to getting, for example, developing countries on board. Developing countries are at a severe disadvantage because we, the rich countries of the world, have got rich by pumping lots of carbon into the atmosphere, and the developing countries, the poorer countries, can justifiably say, why can't we do the same thing too? After all, you prospered for years this way. And so I think the answer is going to have to be, we have to come up with some clever transfers. That is, in exchange for China agreeing or India agreeing to sign on, they're going to have to be given something else, perhaps unrelated to climate change, such as some sort of trade advantage, or it might be related to climate change. We might choose to transfer the technology necessary to maintain output at a lower carbon level. So some kind of transfer scheme I think is going to have to be the key. But it's a tough problem. Back there. Okay, so the question is, would we have to change the Constitution to improve the presidential election system? As some of you know, this topic is a bit of a hobby horse for me. The answer to the question is no. Let me give the 30-second rendition. One of the main problems with the current system, and this was painfully evident in the 2000 presidential election, but also to some extent in the 1992 presidential election, is that third-party candidates, in 2000 it was Ralph Nader, even if they are themselves completely out of the running, can change the entire outcome. So in Florida, if you'll recall, in 2000, Bush beat Gore by 500-odd votes, but over almost 100,000 people voted for Nader. So if those people had been voting for Bush or Gore, well, the evidence suggests most of them would have gone for Gore. That tells us that the election would have gone the other way. And this is a recurrent theme. Not only in American presidential elections, but in French presidential elections and in other countries throughout the world, that these third-party candidates end up changing the outcome. Well, there is a straightforward way that each state could avoid the influence of third-party candidates. This would not require a constitutional amendment because each state is free to determine for itself how it awards its electoral college votes. So we can do it if we have the will to do it. Edward.
Undoubtedly noted, most of the proposals to essentially abolish the electoral college without constitutional amendment.
Right.
Bills that would have to be passed in a sufficient number of states that would pass their electoral votes.
That's right. That's right.
Our state is one of the few that's left.
Yeah, that's right. As Edward correctly points out, there is a measure going around where states pledge to award their electoral college votes to the winner of the national popular contest. And this would, in effect, they pledge to do it if a majority of electoral votes correspond to states who have made this pledge. And that would circumvent the Constitution. Two problems with that measure. First, we've got a long way to go before it's passed, and probably there are enough states out there, small states in particular, who stand to gain from the current system so that they're probably not going to vote for this bill. Admittedly, it's easier to pass this bill than to change the Constitution. But even if the bill did pass, that doesn't eliminate the problem that I was referring to, which is the effect of third-party candidates. The same problem would occur on a national level rather than in the state of Florida.
Obviously, in principle, you can combine them.
Well, I think that would be a step in the right direction. The problem is that the bill you're referring to requires a coalition of states to agree, whereas the measure that I'm talking about can be done state by state, so it doesn't require any coordination.
Some people would argue that the problem is not third-party candidates, but the two major parties.
That's right. There are lots of problems with the current system. Let's try to fix them one at a time. Yeah.
If the Democrats
Well, that's a good question. The problem is that it's not a fully specified question, because in order for mechanism design theory to apply, you have to first be clear what your goals are. And it's not clear in the case of the Democratic Party what their goals are. This reminds me of the old line of Will Rogers. Will Rogers said that he belonged to no organized party. He was a Democrat. I didn't catch the first part of the question. Oh, in the Alice and Bob example. They're, the cake example or the energy example? They appear twice tonight. Sorry? Okay. Well, let's take the energy example. I was talking as though they behaved entirely non-cooperatively. That is, each individual chose on his or her own without even necessarily talking to the other person. So that's a non-cooperative situation. But actually, it turns out that it wouldn't make any difference if they did cooperate. They would still end up with exactly the same outcome. I wonder if I can show that to you. Let's see. I'm trying to get back to the, well, I'm not going to be able to get back to that slide, but you'll recall that in state 1, that was the state where the future was not weighted very heavily. Bob had an incentive to play the left row, regardless of what Alice did. And that fact means that it doesn't matter whether Bob is talking to Alice or cooperating with Alice or not talking to Alice. He's always going to play the left row. But once his behavior is determined, once Alice knows that Bob is going to be playing the left row, she's going to play the top. She's going to play the top strategy herself. So the outcome, you get the same outcome regardless of whether the two parties are cooperating or not. Now that's actually special to this example. More generally, it might make a difference if we look at it from a cooperative or a non-cooperative point of view. And in that case, if we're not sure whether participants are going to be cooperating or not, we will want to build into the mechanism the same property that held in this example. That is, we want to make the outcome robust to the degree of cooperation that actually takes place. Oh, okay. So by assumption, they're in the same state. State 1 means that both consumers put most of the weight on the present, and state 2 means that they both put most of the weight on the future. I think your question is getting at what if there are 4 possible states? So Bob is putting most of the weight on the present, but Alice is looking to the future, or vice versa. That would be a more elaborate example. It would have 4 states rather than 2, but the same principles which allow us to solve the problem in the 2-state case could be applied to that more elaborate case as well.
How is the mechanism design affected by secrecy?
Secrecy on whose part? Yes. So the question is, how is mechanism design affected by secrecy? The whole problem from the mechanism designer's point of view, of course, is precisely that the state of the world is a secret. The players may know it, Alice and Bob may know it, but the mechanism designer doesn't know it. And when the two and when Alice and Bob actually play the mechanism, Alice is going to predicate her own decision on what she thinks Bob is going to do and vice versa. But again, in the particular mechanism I constructed, Alice can see for herself that Bob has a strong incentive to play the left column. So Bob doesn't have to tell her this. He can keep all of his cards to himself, but she can see for herself that regardless of what she does, Bob is always better off playing the left column. So she can count on his playing the left column, and given that he's playing the left column, she's going to want to play the top row. So the trick in mechanism design is to come up with mechanisms so that secrecy doesn't matter, that we get the right outcome, even if players are being secret, or to use the language that a previous questioner used, players are playing non-cooperatively.
Charles, did you have a question?
Sure. Will the two participants perceive the game as fair? It was clear in the big example that the perception that it's fair.
Right.
Is it a more complicated game?
That's a good question. And this comes back to the goals. Mechanism design is a theory about how to achieve particular goals. I haven't said anything about how it was that we decided on those goals. I just assumed, in the cake example, that a cake division in which each kid thinks that she's getting at least half the cake is the right outcome. How society decides on its social goals is an important question, but it's in some sense outside the realm.
I understand that the goals are the goals that we have fixed, but to elicit the response,
Right.
I'm just not sure that, for example, all of these participants had four preferences, or preferences between four items. We had to take the fours, so to speak, to choose between two items in the right game. And I wonder, and it's not obvious to me, so
Oh, well, if we...
perceived as some sort of discretion or something that might be unfair in some sense.
Well, if we look at this mechanism, all four energy alternatives do appear. So in some sense, the parties could choose any of the four, depending on their actions, on their joint actions. It just turns out that when they behave in their own best interest, they will either be choosing oil or gas. But that's their choice. And as long as we agree, as long as society agrees that oil is the right outcome in state one and gas is the right outcome in state two, it would be hard, I think, to quarrel with this being an appropriate mechanism for implementing those goals.
Let's thank Eric for a very lucid talk.